thank you, Elizabeth, for the kind introduction. It's almost too much to be here. You know, it's kind of a homecoming for us, of course. We typically would never come to this space. This was a different territory, but as all of the Cooper Union students know, the third floor was the place of joy and strife, and we carry that with us to this day. In fact, we couldn't really even go close to the building, I think, for at least 3 years after graduation. It was kind of post-traumatic stress, but I think we're now comfortable enough, you know, to do that. But no, I just wanted to, you know, thank the Architectural League, Anne Rieselbach and Rosalie Ginevero for inviting us. And I also just wanted to make a, you know, a quick mention, you know, of Cooper Union people whom we'd studied with, of course, John Hejduk, and then the, you know, really fantastic professor of engineering and engineer Israel Sinek, who worked with us on 014. I'm sorry that, well, I'm glad he lived to see it completed. I'm sorry that the latest project that we're involved in with his office, he won't see, but he was there, you know, at the beginning, and he really kind of still leaves an enormous presence in our work. So, but yeah, I guess we can begin. Tonight, should we advance? We are going to talk about recent work, mainly about 3 projects, about the 014 Tower in Dubai, the Pop Music Center in Taiwan, and the most recent competition that we won last year for the Kaohsiung Port Terminal. And we're just going to touch on the airport project. But anyway, the kind of main thrust of the lecture, because it intersects our practice, is about, you know, working more or less remotely and doing projects that in a way occupy a very different notion of context than what one would understand as a kind of classical understanding of place. That I and Nanako will try to describe how the logics of construction, the way projects are designed and the way they get executed have really shifted the territory of context, and as a consequence have resulted, for better or worse, in new kinds of cities, ones that really can't be connected back to traditional form making and certainly to kind of notions of traditional society. So Dubai, of course, is one of those non-place places, almost an instant city and an instant urbanism, and that was the opportunity for us, that city, to finally realize a major project. So I'm going to be showing 014 first, and I'll try to open up some of the issues that have kind of retrospectively interested us about Dubai and about other places. These are, you know, 2 very well-known images of, you know, just the kind of phenomenal development of Dubai, you know, over the course of 15 or so years. The fact that a city could be essentially built tabula rasa, that all of the infrastructure and all of the buildings were more or less designed remotely, became, you know, really the result of architects and planners' visions who were not locals at all, but who were, you know, coming up with these ideas mainly in the United Kingdom and to a lesser extent in the United States, resulted in a very peculiar and interesting territory to operate in. One of the kind of signal features of these places is that since they are more or less, they're designed from nothing, they would be programmed almost like one would program a building. So within Dubai, you find the development of these micro-cities, each of which is themed, each of which is more or less monofunctional, which means there is very little understanding of mixed use here. The way people then work, live, and play is very strange because they have to drive miles to get to work. There are almost continuous traffic jams, at least there were up until about 3 years ago, in Dubai. There were very few options in terms of how one could live one's life. You basically would have to go to a place where you would live, to a place where you would work, and to a place where you would play, all by car and all back into a kind of air-conditioned environment. So very strange place, and even stranger, the kinds of projections that were made for these mini-cities. This is Business Bay. This is an early rendering of Business Bay, and this was where our 014 is located. We called it a little slice of hell. It was just kind of so relentlessly kind of oppressive in its initial planning that we had to come up. We felt, of course, we were working not at the planning level, but just at the scale of building, but that our building would somehow have to step outside of the kinds of developer norms that were expected, in this master plan. And that was something we discussed very closely with the developer, Shahab Lutfi, and he was a really willing and really expert partner in trying to overcome the kind of strange homogeneity that was kind of automatically expected as part of these developments. This is the reality of the site. This was what we first visited when we came. So these kinds of renderings on the one hand and very slick pamphlets, and then the reality of the place, as yet mainly unbuilt. And so, like I said, the final results are not characteristically of anywhere. Kuala Lumpur, Shanghai to a certain extent, and of course Dubai are more similar than they are different. And our first introduction to Dubai came via competition. This was for the central iconic building in the middle of Business Bay, in the middle of that circle. And so this is Rem Koolhaas's proposal. We were up against Tom Main, Rem Koolhaas, and who else? Some others. Rem was very clever, as he always is. He basically tried to anticipate what his competition would do. And so you see in the background on the horizon a version of the United Architects Tower for Ground Zero. That was part of the group we were working with when we were involved in that project, so he expected something along those lines. Another project more or less like a Zaha Hadid, and another one like Tom Main. And then he delivered this very austere prism, a kind of modernist trope, in contrast to all of the architectural calisthenics around it. Of course, that's a very old way of kind of delivering a building to the city. Mies did it beautifully, this kind of modernist prism, in amongst the 19th century city. And I think it's a very important, issue. We were, keenly aware of the kind of steel and glass buildings of whatever style that were being proposed for Dubai, and we were really set on trying to do something different. And so 014 really kind of went through a long gestation process, but it was basically an exercise for us in trying to come up with another model for not a super high-rise building, but a 22-story office tower. It also, given the legacy of the office tower, office building, the first ones, of course, were created in Chicago, and there's a wonderful essay by Colin Rowe called Chicago Frame, where one of the kind of statements is that they accepted the conditions imposed by the speculator. It was a very, gridded steel structures that were hyper efficient, were able to contain all of the mercantile functions really well, and we're really very much against any notion of being icons. Well, if you flash forward to the past 10 years in a place like Dubai, again, there were very stringent developer norms, but there it was almost a foregone conclusion. You had to do an iconic building. So we embraced that, but then it became a question of how can one do an iconic building that isn't like every other iconic building. Of course, that's a tall order, and that was one of the things that really concerned us. The other part of, it wasn't just about icons, but it was also about operational issues, in the city because of all of those, as kind of a consequence of all of those micro-cities, themed cities, you get the proliferation of tall buildings along main streets. This is Sheikh Zayed Road, a view of that. And then just behind all of those tall, iconic buildings, you get one after another a series of parking structures. So you get a very active frontage with the iconic building, and then all of the pragmatic stuff happens behind, but that street is completely dead. But because people don't really walk around on the street, and they're delivered almost entirely by car, this is accepted. But it was something that we wanted to challenge. So we were given, a set of very precise codes to follow in Business Bay. They were mainly developed by the British firm Halcrow. I kind of, have a soft spot for Halcrow because one of the founders was involved in the design of the Lancaster bomber and all kinds of interesting things during the Second World War, but I'm not terribly excited about the things that grew out of that firm in terms of their planning regime, because it was a very, what Rem would call sort of sub-postmodern in terms of the way the city is understood. So, you would have a very active podium base, as you see here, an arcade, again, just in the front of the building, and then the kind of ubiquitous parking structure behind. So working with our developer, we tried to kind of work within the code, but also to kind of find ways around, especially the aesthetic strictures of the code, and then tried to, and kind of argued successfully to implement them. So instead of just a podium base with activity at ground level, we were really interested in trying to, because podia here would be connected, that we envisioned the possibility of active activity, of public activity on two levels, at the ground and also elevated on top of the podium. Instead of an applied arcade, we started to think through the issue of the building envelope and the possibility of creating an arcade-like space, that is a space behind the exterior shell, what turned out to be a shell, and the lobby, and have that function as the covered place to be away from the sun, and even potentially where street vendors could work. And then the other thing that was really important, and especially on the site that we had, was to free the ground plane. Now, these are very modernist sorts of moves, but you know, that it was really important with this building, because it was directly on the esplanade at Dubai Creek, that one could basically use the building like a gateway, that the general public could move under a super elevated podium, so, you know, and be able to access that waterfront esplanade. So typically the podium, you know, in the most kind of dull, pragmatic way, is filled with cars from ground up, but we were able to convince our developer that because of that site, he could get a lot more rent, you know, programming that space and not filling it with cars, and also to free the ground plane. So it's higher than Lever House. And again, we saw the building not just as an isolated object, but especially at the level of the podia, that those should be connected, and that there could be park space, there could be public space developed. As it turned out, the podia are connected, but they're also divided. It was an unfortunate sort of you know, issue in Dubai that they really didn't allow for the kind of second level of public space, but it was important for us, and maybe that's the utopian part of the project, that we still have it there so that at some future date, that ground plane might be opened up. And then the podia would be more or less distinct from the tower form, and bridges would connect into the tower. So it was important to see those things as really articulate from one another. And also, you know, I'm going to go into a little bit of a digression here, but it's an aesthetic issue which is very dear to our hearts. It's a question of, you know, because we're using very advanced tools and computation, a lot of people, of course, in our generation are, we always felt intuitively a certain resistance, and maybe it's because we came out of Cooper Union where, you know, working with people like Sue Gussow sitting in the audience here, drawing and making, physical building were tremendously important. So the sensibility that comes out of that kind of training really puts us in a very peculiar relationship to the kind of I know, excess in a way that the computer, you know, is capable of producing. So I want to kind of talk about these bicycle parts for a second, because it was a very interesting kind of moment for me. These came out, the ones on the left came out in around 1987-88. And that was designed by the Italian company Campagnolo. They were, and still are, considered one of the top flight bicycle parts companies. They were under attack by the Japanese at that point, because the Japanese, frankly, had designed much more efficient, much more rational bike parts. But Campagnolo was known as, you know, they produced these incredible jewels, which kind of functioned beautifully for racers, but they were also, the attention to detail was really unsurpassed. But I would want to say that it's a really interesting moment, because they had to go up against a group who were using computers. And these old tool and die makers who were at the end of their careers, really, looked at some of the Japanese stuff and then decided that they would do what looks like a computer would do, but did it totally manually. And what they finally produced, I think, is, to me, the ideal. I mean, history stopped. When I saw those parts, I nearly wanted to die. I mean, it was just so beautiful, you know, that my teeth hurt. And that became a kind of aesthetic touchstone for us, that we would use those, you know, we would use the computer, but it was always, it was and is a kind of battle between the almost infinite flexibility that a computer can do, and then this kind of obsessive aesthetic. So we hope we can produce things as gorgeous as these. That's our desire. Anyway, to get more philosophical for a second, one of the things that we speculated on after designing 014 was the strangeness of the building. And I remembered an essay by Walter Benjamin called The Work of Art in the Age of Mechanical Reproduction. And he talks about the kind of force of natural objects. And the mountain is given as a kind of exemplary natural object that's rooted. It's the opposite of a mass-produced thing. And it produces what he calls the effect of a distance, which is also a kind of sublime. And in a way, and it's very hard to show here because you really need to be driving by 014, but because of the ability to produce continuous variation, to produce things that appear to be somewhere between the natural and the artificial, you get that kind of aura emanating out of the objects, that they're quasi-natural, I would say. And another thing which is more technically associated with Benjamin's argument is that the mountain is a kind of single original. And the situation in old production is that you have originals and you have copies. Now, what we as architects and designers do are produce iterations. We don't really produce originals anymore. So in a way, the whole situation has flipped. And that also leads us to, I'm kind of comparing different directions in attitudes and work to context. So there's Woody Allen's Zelig is the kind of essential shapeshifter. He becomes the context. He becomes whatever he's close to. So he can become an Indian, he become a black jazz musician, he becomes a Nazi as soon as he gets close to those people. And I would say that's one form of contextualism in architecture, where you, an Italian architect, you look at the local culture and then you try to do a kind of an updated version of the traditional craft culture, traditional society's architecture. I think a much more interesting figure as an analog would be Chauncey Gardiner. The way in which this character, in being there, basically becomes, he's kind of an empty cipher. People project meaning onto him, but he's actually talking about some very simple things. He's talking about gardening. So I hope our work, in a way, can be read that way. Good. And, I would want to say that, the kind of use of the diagrid in the structuring of the 014 tower does resonate with, traditional crafts and with the minor arts. But actually, we weren't interested in basket weaving from that direction because of our own obsessions. We were looking at geodetic basket weaving in Wellington bombers. So the origin really isn't that important, but the effect is. Likewise, the building, the exoskeleton shell, can be very clearly associated with bone, and others have, of course, associated it with laundry baskets or Melnikov's house. So there are many, many projections onto the meaning, onto the building that are in a way out of control, our control. This came out of a blog, a Russian blog, where the writer was really convinced that we were looking at Melnikov's house. At first I thought it was absurd, but then I started to think, yes, that's true. I mean, even if we weren't consciously looking at it, there was a connection. It definitely resonated. And of course, there were people making fun of the building too, I mean, it's basically once designed, subject. So yeah, I'll quickly kind of talk about the basic organization of the building. It's a a soft cruciform plan. The exoskeleton of this building is in concrete. It's 22 stories high, and then it's surrounded by a two-level elevated podium, and then finally, because we argued so strenuously, we're able to put all of the cars below grade. So a very simple kind of plan form that was in its final form, a straight extrusion. But we went through a whole series of iterations before we arrived at that point, and that was part of the kind of discussion with the developer. At first, he wanted us to do a design based upon the 84-story tower that we proposed in that competition. Of course, it's a quarter of the scale and size of the 84-story building, but he really wanted that kind of formal elaboration. And we went through 16 or more iterations trying to kind of balance the functions of what at that point was a mixed-use tower. It was half residential, half office, and get it to fit in this complex envelope, and we completely failed. So we then developed a kind of a mixed-use version, but a more conventional steel and glass building with a curtain wall and then column and slab structure. We were really not terribly happy with it. It seemed like a bad compromise between the kind of overly elaborated envelope and then what we knew to be fairly common in terms of the kind of appearance of buildings in Dubai with the curtain wall. So we worked very closely with Israel Sinek, our engineer, and his team, trying to kind of go beyond the sort of normal expectation. And the issue of an exoskeleton came up, and we started to explore that, pulling the structure to the outside of the building. That also connected to some of the issues that we were looking at in the Chicago Frame article by Colin Rowe, where he points to a really idiosyncratic and singular proposal in Chicago, which goes against the grid tradition totally, and that was Frank Lloyd Wright's St. Mark's Tower. And in a way, O14 is the inversion of St. Mark's Tower. St. Mark's Tower, albeit residential, has a very strong central supporting core and then a series of cantilevering trays for the apartments in a pinwheel pattern. We took that idea of the strong core and then expanded it. We actually, the core got pulled to the outside in a sense. And then the slabs hang from this very strong external structure. So it's a kind of inverse. And here is an illustration of that, if we can get this to... Oh, I'm just not seeing it. Okay. Notionally, the columns go to the outside and fuse and become the shell. And because of that, we have a structure fully on the outside, and in our initial investigations, we put glass in the holes. Well, it turned out that, given all of the kind of tolerance issues in casting concrete, we would get really heavy frames around all of the openings. So we decided to kind of pull the glazing back away from the structure, have that a meter inside, the meter being the minimal distance for window cleaning, and in effect created an external structure, a sunscreen, and a cavity. That happened to be a really excellent passive solar system. because we were able to, after we found out about, discussed it with our mechanical engineers, we minimized the connections between the external shell and the slabs, and we're able to really open up that space to create what they call a stack effect. So the building saves energy, about 30% of cooling costs, according to the mechanical engineers, because of that configuration. But it was really the byproduct, I have to say, of other operations that were, mainly aesthetic and structural. So this shows the stack effect in operation. And so we have another aside about this whole issue of sustainability. I think it's really important to understand that sustainability is not really, when it comes down to it, an architectural issue. It's a very important, of course, health and safety issue. It's our responsibility to do sustainable buildings. But it's also clear when you look at projects as different, as Tom Main's building for Cooper Union here, or the G.W. Bush Library by Stern, both of which, received LEED Platinum ratings, that the whole issue of kind of form and design is independent of it, which is, I think, the way it should be. It actually, speaks to freedom of expression, and that really there is no such thing as a sustainable style. Of course, one can always, make it that way, and it then becomes a symbolic issue of, well, whether you want your building to represent that. But strictly speaking, is not something inherent to architecture. So, that aside, the other issue that was very important in kind of thinking through the building is to come up with a way of having a very simple mass for the building and then a very highly patterned envelope. And we were doing that as a way of defeating readings of kind of obvious readings of scale of the building, of how tall the building is, and being able to really, clearly define where floor levels were. So the toad and the pyramid, in a sense, are kind of two opposing models that we brought together. And in a direct way, what that meant was that, yes, we used a diagrid, and most diagrids and structures are made to correlate with the floor levels, and we deliberately shifted those relationships. This is sort of out-of-phase diagrid, which meant that the connections also become very asymmetrical in plan, but it does actually serve to mask readings. And this is a kind of a blog where the bloggers were trying to figure out where the floors were and where the openings were relative to the rendering in the final building. So again, it was an iterative process, and once we set up the parameters, and essentially we worked with an extreme amount of redundancy in the structure. We knew that we had quite a bit of latitude in terms of how we could distribute openings, and then it really became for us almost a painterly exercise. We basically didn't want to have the viewer either understand the floor levels or to be able to track clearly the forces of the diagrid down to the bottom, and that we'd create a kind of turbulence field that defeated those kinds of readings, that one would follow a solid area, it would diminish, it would shift over. It was a matter of kind of working that logic and the solar screening logic against where we finally had to deliver the forces, which was towards the kind of regular column grid below ground. So that was a really interesting series of exercises. So we finally came up with a satisfactory pattern, and this is the unrolled shell. All those horizontal kind of dashes are the connections to the slabs. And so you get a very different reading of the building as compared to kind of the typically gridded skyscraper where it reinforces the subject's position, the kind of one-point perspective. Here, as you move around the building, you get very different kind of oscillations of scale and very different kind of shifting vanishing points when you look obliquely up. And it reminded me of something I had seen as a kid, actually, the Yellow Submarine movie, where the Nowhere Man occupied the Sea of Holes. And you get this very strange sense of contraction and expansion in that universe. So that was something that resonated with the project. And it also, moving away from the kind of purely phenomenal side of it, does very different things to the organization and the life of the office. So on the left, the Inland Steel building could be argued as a very pure representation of the functions within, especially at that period where the filing and the desks and just the amount of paper in an office enforced a regularity in the plan and also enforced a certain homogeneity in the life of the worker. So this is a painting by George Tooker, which is kind of an extreme kind of description of that. And so because there's such a variegated facade, moving from the effect of the building towards its operation, people, we hope, and they are starting to do this, organize the interior very differently. Whether they want a lighter space or a darker space depends on where they want to be. And it produces a very, very different atmosphere in the office rather than the kind of highly regimented systems before. Also, because the shell is a meter away from the edge of the building, you get very interesting kind of staccato, oblique views up and down that you don't get in a building where, kind of typical curtain wall building where the glazing is right up against the slab edge. This is an unfortunate iteration, and it was a moment when we were asked not to do the diagrid, but to organize in horizontal and vertical pattern the openings. And fortunately, and these are all the arguments against it, we got also our structural engineer involved, Israel Sinek, who said it wasn't a true diagrid, it was a Viren deal, it was corrupt, it was bad, and we were just delighted that finally the developer and the contractor put that aside and we got the diagonal. There's also a really interesting thing that happens, and I think this is characteristic of design today, because there's such a close connection between how we design in the office, fabrication, and the final result, that the renderings look shockingly like the finished building. And so there was a kind of material moment while the building was constructed where it was, kind of the concrete was really evident, but they, because of the automated form work and then an awful lot of hand work on the building, you get a really seamless sense of continuity, almost like a built rendering. There's also a fourth state that I'm not showing here, is when the building is now kind of grimy and covered with sand, and it's also fascinating because it's starting to look, like a blasted sort of ancient desert plant. So the states of the building have been really interesting in retrospect. And this is kind of an animation of the iterations we went through, kind of working through the facade design, and as they kind of track, as the forces track down the facade. And as a kind of final discussion of the structural aspect of 014, we realized that at first we thought what we were doing was really detached from the kind of engineering of tall buildings that you'd see like in Les Robertson's design for the World Trade Center. These were drawings that were made at Princeton, the ones on the left, of his building, and apparently 14 different alloys of steel were employed in the World Trade Center. But in order to really kind of enforce uniformity in the facade, the kind of homogeneity in the facade, all of the, there were different forces in play, but all of the members geometrically were held regular. What we're doing with 014 is connected to that, but we were after the opposite, kind of an extreme heterogeneity, but they're part of a spectrum of designing, and I think that's a really interesting point. It's not a departure, but it's about operating at the other end of the spectrum, say from regularity. But we were working with a strength of concrete that could handle that amount of variation within it, and changes in the kind of density of the rebar. So I'm going to hand this over to Nanako now.
We try to be very economical, so we came up with 5 standard openings. So here it shows 219 reusable molds for 918 openings. But at the end of the day, it's much easier to just make new one for each holes. Means this meant it we could have infinite variation of the holes. Here is a construction shot early in the building showing the diagram of reinforcement and the digital cut form for void form for the openings. And the shell changes thickness from 60 centimeter to the podium level, and from there it's become 40 centimeter to the top. This is the view, rooftop view. Each holes frame the different views here, and overall view of the whole buildings. Podium is facing Dubai Creek and connecting to the building with multiple bridges. And here, this building gives different kind of relationship with the floors and openings. The podium is connected with a bridge, multiple bridges, and a restaurant is located on top of the podium level, so the people can go into the wider rooftop and enjoy the spectacular views. And here, this is arcade space between the window walls and exoskeletons. And here, when you look up, you can see the connection of the slab connected by tongues to the exoskeletons. This is the view looking down between window walls and exoskeletons. And also, series of tongues are coming from the slab connecting to the exoskeletons. View of the outer public space and arcade are looking into the lobby space. 014 and its neighboring in construction with the Burj Khalifa in the background. Here is the detail of exoskeleton at the roof level. The slide shows the changing geometry of the openings as they move over convex and concave surface of the shell. The wide view of the rooftop and the reflection of the window wall 1 meter back from the exoskeleton, enough space for the window washing platform and stack effect. This view from the under the podium shows how it is independently supported. Also shows the bridge coming out of 2 levels of podiums. This is the view of the lobbies, express its compressed dog bone shape of the ceiling and the reflection of the exoskeleton on the frosted glass core wall. Here, this is the reception desk we designed, and actually this desk took us more than 1 year to create, and the building took only 2 years. So you can see you can, innocently draw things in a computer, and then in the reality you had to make it. A making process is everything required with the hands and the shaping and sanding. So this is the result of the reception desk took so long. And in the back of the reception desk, the reflection of the opening is on the lobby wall, which is very nice. Here we have the slide. This slide shows the podium facade facing the Dubai Creek.